Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
There's been a constant sort of process of, a new left and then a new left. And probably in about 20 years' time, people will say, well, the new left or the new left began with TWT. So I'd say TWT is very much in the tradition of the different new lefts that go back, well, in my opinion, go back to 1956, or the contemporary new left. I mean, you could say we've got traditions like William Morris and so on, and of course Marx, and parts of Trotsky, and that we could draw on. But in terms of a contemporary sort of continuity, moment that has got many continuities that have been elaborated on and developed since that period, but within the lifetime of some people alive, is the moment of 1956, when the Soviet Union brutally repressed a movement, well, not a movement, a mass uprising in Hungary, that was really a movement for democracy and freedom. It wasn't anti-communist, it wasn't anti, the socialization of production, but it was wanting democracy, wanting freedom in that context. And it was also, in a way, implicitly or increasingly explicitly against the sort of, I won't say imperialism, but domination of the Soviet Union over its border countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia and the rest of Central Europe. Now that, that suppression, I mean, after a period of negotiation and so on, in the end, the Soviet Union sent in tanks and 2,500 people were killed and 200,000 left Hungary. Now, imagine if you're part of a party, the Communist Party in Britain, which was not massive, but it was significant, had a lot of importance and influence in the unions and therefore in parts of the Labour Party. But, if your party that looked to the Soviet Union, looked to another country as its kind of model, and that model started actually, attacking, invading another country and repressing and killing, literally thousands of people, that would cause a shock. And it caused a huge shock, a sort of political earthquake in the Communist Party. And one result of that was that many intellectuals, and also both intellectuals in the sense of academics and writers, but also many, in a way, most of the Communist Party were thoughtful and, what Gramsci called organic intellectuals, people who haven't necessarily had an academic education, but have in their own way developed an academic, or not an academic, but an intellectual capacity to interrogate, to criticize, to read widely. It led to an exodus of these people, sometimes not leaving immediately, but a lot of angst, a lot of discussion. They would discuss with each other, meet with each other. In the Communist Party, it was banned to have contact between branches, because the British Communist Party, was also rather authoritarian. And so that idea of networking across branches was complete no-no. But of course, it happened after 56. People got in touch and discussed and what's going on and what's socialism. And that led to a number of people leaving, most notably E.P. Thompson, the wonderful social historian who wrote The Making of the English Working Class. Also John Saville, a notable historian. And then other people who I can't quite remember whether they left at that point, or, a lot of people left in the years to follow. Raphael Samuel, another historian. I mean, there are a lot of historians that interestingly left at that time. And then masses of teachers, worker intellectuals, and it was a significant enough movement of people leaving the Communist Party or almost leaving to form a movement, literally, of what was called the New Left. The New Left meaning a left that was dissociating itself from what was considered the left at that time, the Communist Party, the Soviet Union and the communist tradition. And they formed left clubs across the country, which were clubs that would read. I mean, in a way, the experience of the Soviet invasion of Hungary had just thrown into question, what is socialism? So previously, there was to an extent, you could say socialism, that's the Soviet Union, the command economy. There was a sort of what many people in the communist tradition felt was a working model. I mean, obviously, even in the 30s with Stalin and so on, there was a lot of debate and argument about whether it was, and a lot of people felt it wasn't, and weren't in the Communist Party. But for those that were, it was a kind of model, basically, even if it needed democratization. And people hoped for exactly the democratization that the Hungarians were arguing for. But that was repressed, so that felt like the end of a line. And people needed to rethink what socialism was. Where do we find it? How do we create it? And it led not to an abandonment of Marxism, but to a kind of in a way, the beginnings, or not the beginnings, but the escalation of a sort of rereading of Marx, discovery or a rediscovery, new emphasis on the early Marx, who talked a lot about alienation and therefore highlighted the issue of workers' control and control over work and the dignity of work, so that socialism was not equated with simply state ownership, but actually required, for the Marxist vision to be met, required an end to alienation, which wasn't just an economic relationship, but one of control and power. And so it began a sort of flourishing of critical Marxist thinking, and led to many journals and conferences and debates. In particular, it led to the creation of a journal called The New Reasoner, which eventually became the New Left Review, and the history of the New Left Review is very interesting. Now, in a way, the themes that came out of that, I'd say, are a real emphasis and desire to study workers' control, because that was clearly absent in the Soviet Union and absent from the kind of model of socialism that was based on the Soviet command economy. So that led to, or not led to, but sort of created favorable conditions for the growth of a very important movement around workers' control. Again, it was all the time a bit like TWT, combining action with thought, so that it was a very reflective movement, and it was coordinated by an organization called the Institute for Workers' Control, that brought together workers who, in that period, in the 50s and 60s, you'd seen economically the growth of workplace power, with the boom and trade union bargaining power growing. There was a huge growth in the shop stewards movement and the power of the shop floor. And in a way, as I talk, I want to, at the risk of a rather multi-leveled and therefore maybe seemingly kind of messy contribution, I want to put the developments of the New Left always in the context of what's happening economically, culturally and politically. And so economically, there was this growth of a shop stewards movement that many intellectuals, including intellectuals involved in trade union education, saw as the basis of a movement for workers' control. Another important thing was cultural developments. This was a time when you know, in a way, you'd got, this was the 50s after all, which was in terms of capitalist culture and political power and economics, was a very uncritical period. I mean, you know, there was the boom, consumerism, you know, hire purchase. So there was a kind of atmosphere of, even as the Conservative Prime Minister at the time said, you've never had it so good. So that led to an atmosphere in terms of the dominant culture of complacency, quite a repressive attitude to social relations. So the nuclear family kind of thrived in the midst of all this, you know, domestic consumerism, and the idea of, you know, living in different ways, challenging the family, challenging convention was quite sort of repressed. So you had the growth then of a whole cultural movement of playwrights, like John Osborne, who wrote this book, this play, Look Back in Anger, very angry, you know, statement against this consensus. You had the emergence of people like Harold Pinter, you know, who'd look at the reality, which was becoming increasingly contrary to the promise of peace and equality that had been the promise of the post-war period. You had the beginnings of the imperial power and military power of the US, the growings of what an important American new leftist called C. Wright Mills called the military industrial complex. So you got a kind of illiberal reality growing throughout the 50s and then the early 60s, to which this new generation of intellectuals that had left the Communist Party were reacting and criticizing and developing the tools to criticize. But this was a period of relative quiescence. And I just read something from this book that Charlie mentioned, where Raymond Williams was a particularly important part of this grouping. That I'm not sure if he'd been in the Communist Party. I think possibly he had. But anyway, he wrote a book called The Long Revolution, which provides a historical perspective on this period of growing sort of critical consciousness, and also in industry and in education, because university education, higher education was growing. There was a kind of slow awakening in culture, in media. I remember there was a group called the Free Communications Group, which people like Alex Coburn had started, and which was a critique of the media, of the BBC. You had satires like That Was the Week That Was. Anyway, he talked about the rising determination almost everywhere that people should govern themselves, because you also have I think he was also thinking of the development of the anti-colonial movement, you know, the movements against British colonialism, you know, in Africa, and obviously India already. You know, you'd seen the liberation of India. Well, I mean, it was obviously a very ambiguous one with the division of India and Pakistan, which was a sort of imperialist, colonialist division. But so you had the emergence across the world of a liberation movement against the colonialism of America, well, initially Britain and France and Spain. And he says he considers this to be a lengthy, difficult and complex but genuine revolution, transforming men and institutions, continually extending and deepened by the actions of millions, continuously and variously opposed by explicit reaction and by the pressure of habitual forms and ideas. Yeah, well, I won't go on. And then you had E.P. Thompson. He was, I think there was an important feature of him and Raphael Samuel and these social historians, where they were very attentive to what was happening beneath the surface of the institutions of the Cold War. I mean, this was a period when the Cold War, you know, was was massive, and therefore any explicit leftist statement publicly was seen as, support for the Soviet Union. So at a very public level, it was very difficult for the left to surface. I mean, Nye Bevan, the founder of the health service, he was fighting for the left. And for CND was growing at this time, and that was a very important sort of mass base for this emerging new left. It meant there was a movement that they were connected to. But, he was like treated, like Tony Benn has been in our era, well, in the 80s. But, he was treated as, just complete scum, just completely, derided by snobbish Tories because he was a working class miner. And it was just amazingly disgusting. But Edward Thompson and so on, they would talk about, how beneath the polarization of power and ideology in the Cold War world, a new rebellious human nature was being formed, just as the new grass springs up beneath the snow. And in a way, that's probably partly why he wrote the Making of the English Working Class, as he wrote during this period of relative quiescence. And in a way, a lot of these intellectuals from the Communist Party, they use that period to write books which are now, kind of crucial resources for us. And he quoted in this a 19th century artisan and historian who said, "People fancy that when all's quiet, that all is stagnating, but propaganda is going on for all that. It's when all is quiet that the seed is a-growing. Republicans and socialists are pressing their doctrines." So I took that as a rather encouraging statement that, when things seem pretty dismal and, defeated or quiescent, actually things are going on. And in a way, TWT is actually about planting those seeds and keeping them alive. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do with Red Pepper, nurturing the seeds that are growing, as Henry Mayhew put it. Anyway, so this was all a growing, and you saw many things. You saw, as well as the cultural things that I mentioned, the playwrights and so on, you also had texts like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which my generation were reading when they were sort of at school. I remember reading it, when I was a school kid. And so this was like a seed that was growing that later, now we're coming up to 68. And this is, in a way, the beginnings of a new wave, another, world-shattering event. This time, it was both in the East, in Central Europe, in Czechoslovakia, a repeat, almost exactly, not quite as devastating, of the invasion of Hungary. You had the invasion of the Czech Republic, or the Czechoslovakia as it was then, because a movement was growing again for democracy and for a new kind of socialism. So Dubček, who was part of that, was trying to pioneer and practice a democratic socialism based on workers' control and democracy. And at the same time, or just before, you had the events of May 1968 in Paris, but also in Mexico, and in a way emulating them in London, particularly the student movement, but the student movement always wanting to connect with the workers' movement, as they did so successfully in Paris and in across France. And so in a way, 68 was like a moment of, we use this word rupture, break from the existing system. And here in Britain and in the West, it kind of added to the dynamics of the previous New Left, a very strong critique of parliamentary socialism. In a way, Ralph Miliband, he was more in Edward Thompson's generation, the generation, he'd not been in the Communist Party, but his friends like Edward Thompson were, and he was part of that group effectively. And he wrote Parliamentary Socialism, in the 60s, kind of looking at why the Labour Party was so right-wing and so parliamentary. I mean, he said it was dogmatic, not about socialism, but about Parliament, its allegiance to Parliament, to the British state, because after all, the British state is based on the idea of the crown in Parliament. So MPs are not accountable to the people, as in many other countries they are, but accountable to the crown, which really means the state in Parliament. So that was a crucial book that then influenced, in a way, my generation of the New Left, which came through 68 when we were radicalized in our approach to our courses, PPE. I was in Oxford doing PPE, and we all developed a critique of PPE and an alternative. I think, Momentum and TWT have developed a sort of a people's PPE. Anyway, all this course critique. At the same time, we were leafleting workers in Cowley in the car industry, and as a result, the disciplinary powers of the university tried to stop us and expel people who were doing this and who were making these kind of links. So 68 was very important. It was also important because it developed, helped to develop some of the organizational principles of the New Left, which I think also had their roots in the 50s and the reaction to the Communist Party. So even then, there was a belief in the importance of democracy. And so very important in the United States. And another feature I must emphasize here is the constant cross-fertilization. So we were very influenced by the student movement in 68 in the US, the Students for Democratic Socialism. And they wrote a manifesto, the Port Huron Manifesto, which the central theme of which was participatory democracy. So from the start, the New Left was about a deeper democracy than parliamentary democracy. On the whole, it wasn't saying we get rid of Parliament, but that it's not enough. We need democracy in our daily lives. We need democratic assemblies to which MPs are accountable. We need a participatory democracy, and that was inspired particularly by the US, but also had its own important sources in the UK, and we were very influenced by the German SDS, which was also a very strong movement, anti-authoritarian movement, which Wilhelm Reich, I can't remember the book he wrote, but it was also very anti-authoritarianism in the family. So in a way, 68 was also the beginnings of the women's movement. Well, it didn't take form until 1970 with the big conference that many people maybe know about in Oxford. But we lived the contradictions of a movement in 68, a mainly students' movement, but not just. There were many non-students part of it, that was very highly democratic in its ethos, but in its daily routines was effectively silencing women. Men were very unself-consciously dominating and, powerful, and sometimes it would, be absolutely dreadful, and women were expected to sort of do all the shit work. But whatever, we'd meet in the, we'd bump into each other in toilets or on the way back from meetings and say, hey, what's all this? What kind of liberation is this? And eventually out of all that came the women's movement, and out of not just that, but also what was happening in society, the repressive nature of the family, the way in which the idea of the non-working housewife had been glorified, and then the importance of books like Betty Friedan's book on, I can't remember the exact name, but it was basically the silent problem, the sort of problem that was not spoken, of women feeling isolated, bringing up children, on their own, not enough, all these sort of silent discontent that led to an explosion of what we called consciousness raising groups. That was like the basic cell of the women's movement, where we emphasized experience, but still experience as the beginnings of insight. If we analyze that experience critically and together, we developed a sort of knowledge that was rooted in experience. I've got a bit of a sore throat. So the women's movement, in a way, I'd say it kind of fed into the New Left and began to redefine many of the politics and principles of organization. The process, it led to more emphasis on process and on new kinds of knowledge, as well as on policies around the needs of women. Sheila Robotham and Lynn Siegel, who was the author of Collective Joy, wrote a book called Beyond the Fragments, Socialism and the Making of Feminism and the Making of Socialism, where we tried to talk about the ways in which feminism needed to remake socialism, or the way in which socialism needed to heed and learn the lessons of feminism to remake itself as a democratic and truly egalitarian movement. So that was 68, and it fed into the sort of workers' movement that was developing, and also the international movement. I mean, key was the movement against the war in Vietnam. And so we had an international consciousness, which I think also is a feature of the TWT that's developed from this tradition. So we, in the end, I'm having to be quick now, I think, we were defeated, or the workers' movement was defeated, particularly by in a way, Thatcher, you could say, and I think David Harvey puts it like this, was a sort of class war against. It was like a counter-revolution against the emerging transformative movement, if not revolutionary movement, that 68 represented and developed into. So, if you like, there was a period of quiescence in, well, after the 70s. The 70s were a very vibrant time where all these movements came together, discussed many ideas, many kind of a bit equivalents of TWT. There was the Convention of the Left that Raymond Williams played a big part in, which had many workshops and ideas and led to organizations which continued on, like the Conference of Socialist Economists and others. So there are many continuities. You'll find this in the history of the New Left, that each phase produced something that lasted. I mean, New Left Review has lasted through all these different phases with Verso books, so that's a great achievement. And then, in a way, what happened was what was produced, I suppose, the late 90s. You know, after things were kept alive, you know, there were movements, local movements particularly, new movements around housing, tenants movements, movements around cuts, and some kind of centres of political education. Ralph Miliband started a series of centres for Marxist education. I and others started a socialist centre in Newcastle. You know, many different initiatives of this kind, trying to provide a sort of educational, intellectual, self-educational space in all these movements. But, you know, the fact of a defeat of the miners particularly, although, you know, the experience of the miners' strike with all the kind of movements that came together, the women's movement, the gay movement, coming together to support the miners, was pretty amazing and influential, and led to a memory that has not gone and has been a shaping of people's imaginary and idea of what the left should be. So then, in a way, the next wave, you could say, was what we call the alter globalization movement, which began with the huge demonstration in Seattle, in the US, against the what's called the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which actually led to a massive success, defeating their multilateral investment agreement, which was an attempt to completely globalize the movement of finance and get rid of all national constraints and control. And this movement, it led first to a lot of kind of counter summits, which were times that people came together internationally to, again, carry on this discussion about what socialism was, a sort of development of a new kind of socialist consciousness coming from reflecting on practice undogmatically and trying to generalize and develop a new vision of a democratic socialism, which led to the world social forums that were kind of, in a way, like international TWTs held in Brazil. We know it, where they would just come out of a dictatorship, strong workers' movement, the Workers' Party, you know, in a way hadn't been defeated by well, in the end was certainly weakened by neoliberalism, but in a way there was a sort of uneven development. So they were victorious in the late 80s and early 90s, at a time when we were weak. And in a way, they say the Berlin Wall didn't fall on us. They were developing a new democratic kind of socialism with all their emphasis on participatory democracy. That was emerging in Latin America as we were facing, you know, difficulties and defeats. So again, there was this international learning process and a sort of international, you know, gaining morale and a sense of what was possible from international examples, which again, I think is a feature of TWT and its efforts all the time to have an international dimension at its conferences, including people who come from those countries. So that, in a way, lasted throughout the first part of the 21st century, you know, with the European Social Forum and the development of a strong idea of a socialist or a radical alternative Europe, which maybe has influenced the whole kind of Remain debate and the idea that there is an alternative. I mean, I won't go into that, but I think that idea of a European left has been important in the development of the new left. So, I mean, here we are in TWT, and it's drawing on all these different strengths. I mean, another feature of the ultra-globalization movement, which was emerging at the same time as the internet and the web and the World Wide Web. And so you have this development of network socialism, new forms of organization that were very egalitarian, very fluid, very horizontal, you know, ideas of which came both from 68 and participatory democracy and then the women's movement. But then, in a way, the international networks and the use of the internet, both in a way as forms of communication that were highly horizontal. You didn't have to go through the center to reach others. You could go directly. But also the metaphors of the internet, the very metaphor of network, and the kind of metaphors of software, open software, sharing knowledge, sharing design of systems, and so on. That's all been influential. I think that's contributed to an even more radical new left in terms of process. So I think, you know, let's end there, but recognize that TWT is a phase in the development of a new left. I mean, I'd say we're still searching for socialism, not searching in the sense of it's out there, you know, like sort of America was out there for Columbus, but it's something that we've got to create ourselves from our own experiences directly, but also experiences we can learn from others. So in a way, the point of bringing people together is not just to talk, but is to exchange experiences and learn from those experiences.